So good morning, everybody. If I can get everyone's attention. So good morning, and thank you. And obviously, if anyone had imposter syndrome, it's me now. So after Jason, not only is he funny, intelligent, and as the national lead for public order policing, he also had a pop at the national decision-making model. So that puts me in a real challenge as a chief constable. So first thing, that's me. It's the Essex badge that belongs to me. So before anyone reports back to Ken and to Tim Smith that I'm planning a takeover, that's not the case. But I am really, really proud to present some amazing piece of works and two wonderful people, Stacey Rothwell and Anna Hook, who for a number of reasons are going to talk to you about the work they've done on this programme. So the first important bit for Peter last night, it is evidence-based, and I think that's really, really important, and they'll explain and see how that is. And the second point I'll make is that they're both police staff members, and Stacey works for our Eastern Region Innovation Network, working across the 7 forces of the Eastern Region and Kent. And Anne works in our Strategic Change Directorate, and again showing that the contribution that it's more than just police officers that are important to policing, and I think that's a really important point. And the third point links back to what Sir Mark said yesterday. You know, we know public trust and confidence is a challenge. We also know that we need to investigate crime, and I think both of the examples and the studies and the work that they've done, you're going to see today, both shows how you can do not simple things, but straightforward things about improving the service to victims. Not only investigates a crime and delivers a better outcome for individuals, but actually improves the trust and confidence in policing through measures which are effective and tested. So I shall hand over first of all now to Anna, who'll start off, and then Stacey will follow through, and then we'll do some questions.
Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. So yeah, the chief is absolutely right. In my day job, I work in the world of change, the change that policing doesn't like. As we've already heard, and supported by my force, like many of you sat there now, to undertake the master's programme at the University of Cambridge and my learning journey for evidence-based policing. Probably worth stating, you've probably already guessed it because I've mentioned I work in the world of change, that I'm not an academic and I'm not an analyst. But actually the support that I've had from all of the staff on this course has taught me to be a pracademic, and that's actually allowed me to do quite a lot to help deliver back to my home force. So firstly, most of you will probably know it, but a little bit about Essex as a county. It's in the southeast of England. We have quite a lot of rural areas up to the north of the county. We have the second longest coastline in the country. Longest if you're talking to anybody outside of Cornwall, and we also have at least 2 airports, a port, the crossing through to Dartford, and a very big metropolitan border that sees us quite busy in certain areas around there. So we've got about 1.8 million people in that county, and as I've just illustrated, there's quite a diverse set of problems, needs and requirements that we have to police against. Essex Police undertake independent community survey activity, quite like most of the forces in this room probably. And over continuing quarters, we identified that there was an emerging satisfaction gap between victims of crime and non-victims of crime that had contact with Essex Police, with victims becoming less satisfied. So that was part of where my thinking started. Just very, very quickly, show of hands in the room, how many people here work for forces with a research strategy? Now, that's not unusual. We've got a research strategy. And when I was starting to think about actually what could I do for my thesis research as part of this programme, that really helped me out. It's very much aligned to our force plan, delivers on a lot of the chief's priorities, but also made me think, you know, we've got this focus on victims that's important to our force, just like all other forces. But how do I now shape that? And how do I test something to see what might improve victim satisfaction? So not in a position to test everything. So the crime type that I pulled out was actually residential dwelling burglary. It's a force priority, obviously in recent years has had quite a lot of Home Office focus and significant impact on victims, whether that be the long-term impact, loss of sentimental items, invasion of privacy, safe space, etc. The intervention was actually a relatively simple one. So what worked for victims of residential dwelling burglary? Basically, I wanted to see whether or not an SMS message expressing concern and support, but giving practical help on crime prevention advice and links to victim support would have an impact on satisfactions of victims of residential dwelling burglary. And this was delivered through a trickle flow randomized control trial. So baseline is obviously everybody gets the agreed business as usual, support for burglary, officer attendance, burglary pack, etc. The only difference was that half of the sample, pretty much half the sample, received a text message after the case was closed where we couldn't identify a perpetrator. Only difference. Why SMS? Now, I would love to say that this sort of came out of some wonderful technical response, but it didn't. It came out of a cohort, like a lot of the people in the room here, where we were sitting having a conversation and working some of this stuff through. Usually there was a beer involved, but you know, that always helps with creative thinking. And we got to a point where most people were telling me they ignored a lot of emails that came through, especially to their personal account, because that's where they signed up to get 10% off everything. So they didn't really look at it. However, when you get a text message through, whether you act on it or not, most people usually read it. One, it's a little bit shorter, but two, it's an immediacy thing. And if you're anything like me, I have to get rid of that one that shows on the little green symbol because it just drives me mad. So SMS is really functional. Everybody's got a phone, and it's fantastic to see so many of you taking photographs of my slides. That's perfect. Utilising them all today. So I just want to read you a little bit of data that helps support why we went down that SMS route. So in Q4 of 2021, Ofcom identified the number of active mobile phone subscriptions at 85 million, which was 1.2 million up from the year before. And the use of SMS and MMS messages were exceeding 10 billion. The same research also outlines that data usage through smartphones has continued to rise in volume by over 25% year on year, indicating that increasing appetite to actually use your phone to access a load of existing resources. That's huge. Data and methodology. So residential dwelling burglary victims. Initially, working with Dr. Strang, I looked at 2019 data, so pre-COVID data, to work out how long this was going to take me. Burglary's not gone up as much as what we had pre-COVID. There could be lots of people working from home still, etc., etc. But it took me a lot longer to get my sample size. So this was all residential dwelling burglary victims between June and November. When I say all, there was a screening process applied. So we removed commercial, non-dwelling, attempted, aggravated. So this is purely residential dwelling burglary. As I said before, all victims received the agreed BAU response, and the experimental group received the SMS text. Randomization by odd and even last digit of the telephone number. I'm not going to dwell on this. There's some difference of opinion as to whether that's true randomization, but in this particular instance, for the most part, it worked and was quite pragmatic. 215 cases made up the full sample, and all of the victims were contacted to follow up in a survey afterwards. So representation from both the control and experimental groups. Responses. Now, this is probably where it gets a little bit interesting. Not that the previous stuff wasn't, but this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So really good news for Essex Police, actually, because this was from contact from our active citizen volunteers. Out of a score of 5, with 5 being high, that satisfaction in both the control group and the experimental group was over 4.2. We were getting actually really good feedback from people that we were visiting after they'd been burgled. As you can see, though, possibly, I don't know how well you can read the questions there, but question 2 looks at that follow-up. And this pretty much reflects the data that we were getting in our own surveys anyway, but also reflects more broadly what the Victims Commissioner has noticed about a lot of forces, is that after that initial contact, the follow-up drops off a little bit. So we know, and it's a focus of the chief and something we're very much adhered to at Force, is how do we pick up that follow-up bit with victims and stop that drop-off? You can also see that actually, and I suppose I was surprised a little bit at this, considering people were victims of crime, the perception of policing prior to the incident was also quite high. Slightly surprising again, and I'm not going to draw too many conclusions from it because it's actually a small element of the sample, but about 10% of the whole sample had a really, really bad view of policing. And actually, following this incident and our response, so not necessarily the intervention, but our response, we've changed over half of those people's minds, which is really, really difficult to do. And if anybody is looking perhaps for a bit of future research, I think that's opened a door a little bit to understand that more fully. Responses, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. The only thing really, and that decision-making presentation has made me think of it, we got a few wrong numbers that surprised us, because actually our data accuracy, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. But when I spoke to some of the active citizen volunteers that undertook the follow-up surveys, telephone surveys, they phoned a couple of people, and we actually had people putting on foreign accents when they find out that it's somebody working with the police on the end of the phone and pretending they'd moved to a different county, which was slightly bizarre. So one of the things that we looked at in hindsight, so this wasn't necessarily something I set out to do, but one of the things we looked at in hindsight was, out of that sample of residential dwelling burglary victims, how many of them were previous victims in the last 5 years? And actually 45% is really quite high. And it was a variety of victimization. I mean, there was a lot of, the majority was low level stuff, you know, motor theft from a motor vehicle, but there was a disturbingly enough amount of really high harm crime. One victim had been a victim 23 times, and we'd attempted to screen out obvious DA markers and DA victims in this because we didn't feel it was an appropriate intervention for that cohort. Most of those with the serious high harm victimization didn't want to participate in the follow-up survey. I think perhaps we might have got a different satisfaction result if they had, but again, who knows? But equally, a low number of those respondents to the survey had been previous victims of residential dwelling burglary. Now, I mention this because honing back to a snapshot of research in the 1980s, one of the biggest indicators that you could be a repeat victim of burglary was being a victim of burglary. And actually, this research didn't find that. So findings, I won't go over these too much, but probably to draw you down to that last point, and we've already spoken about cost. If we were to send every victim of residential dwelling burglary this particular intervention, the cost to the force of sending it, not necessarily the resources to send it, I'll come on to that, but the cost of sending it would be £15 for the year. So whilst I might not have seen a statistically significant difference, we did see some improvement in satisfaction. And I think anybody will agree that for £15, that's probably worth it. So this slide is my ode to Sir Dennis O'Connor. And I'm sure many of you in the room will hear this a lot. So what? Why is this important? I have those words ringing in my ear from the 2 years I spent at Cambridge, and they've stood me in good stead. So we do a great response to victims initially, but we show a decline. What do we do about it? We did see an increase in satisfaction. I think that we would want possibly somebody in the future to test why we didn't get a lot of response to the SMS survey that was part of the follow-up survey. Although actually since then, my work has influenced some of the work that we're doing in our control room, who send out an immediate SMS survey, satisfaction survey, and they've had thousands of responses in. And it seems to be, looking at their work, the immediacy of receiving that survey message afterwards. A high proportion of the sample were previous victims. So big learning here, and obviously potentially another piece of future research. One message doesn't fit all. We don't want to undo the good that we've done. When people start to get multiple messages of this type, it takes away that personalization. Impact on resources. And again, this is something that I am working on in force and linking it into existing activity around some movement on target operating models we've got going on in our contact management command, but also the work we're doing on RPA, so automation, and thinking about how this might fit in as part of that work that we're already doing. But for me, this really is how it links to the bigger picture. And probably what I've told you is really quite obvious, but I've kind of gone through the process to evidence it. And victims of different crimes have different expectations of the response that they get. So it sounds really obvious when you say it, but actually the better we tailor some of our responses to victims, and they don't have to be expensive and they don't have to be, huge, but actually the more we tailor them, the better satisfaction is going to get. And actually we'll be supporting victims better to recover from the crime they've been victim of. I think as well, I'll apologise to Ben Clark, and if anybody speaks to him, I don't want to butcher his research, but in a nutshell, his intervention around victims of cycle and vehicle crime, the letter that he sent out to victims of both of those, paraphrasing, but the victims of cycle crime couldn't believe somebody had bothered to send them a letter. It was brilliant. Satisfaction's gone up. Victims of vehicle crime, second biggest outlay you're likely to make, couldn't believe all they got was a letter. And again, paraphrasing. So, but that sort of links into tailoring this response to victims. This is basically just a snapshot to show you that everything wasn't all wonderful. Some of it was honest feedback from people that we didn't do as good a job as we could have done. And the biggest one we took is some of the obvious. So due to loss of personal documents, it would have been useful to have information on identity theft. We've updated our pack immediately. That's an easy, quick win. So whatever you do on the long term with a lot of this research, I have to say it's important to take out those quick wins and implement them quickly as well. And just to finish off, if there's anybody in this room that is about to start thinking what they're going to do with their thesis work in year 2, you're probably very daunted by the fact that RCT keeps coming up. I was really daunted by it. I worked really hard at it. This was a simple intervention and it was manic. I will promise you now it would be the best thing you ever do. So you really, really get a lot out of it. I shall hand over to Stacey.
Hello, everyone. My name's Stacey Rothwell, so I'm the Network Director for the Eastern Region Innovation Network. I've worked alongside Mr. Harrington and Anna Hook on various work, but today I'm going to tell you a story that you may have heard before, but it's got a slightly different ending. So I'm going to keep you interested if I've entertained you with this one before, but essentially it's a randomised control trial that we undertook in Kent for my thesis. And it was done really to look at the ways in which we can service victims of domestic abuse differently. So the reason the study came about was because after doing some research, I established that calls in England to the police had trebled in the past 2 decades. During 2018, we'd received over 26 million telephone calls, and we all know there are many other ways now to report to the police. The HMRC did a report called Hard Yards, and in that they said, beyond the most urgent calls, promised physical response is no longer rapid, but sometimes it's absent entirely, with one quarter of police forces not managing demand effectively, with thousands of calls waiting in queues for available officers to serve them. So I had a look at the data in Kent, and during 2019, we'd received over 800,000 telephone calls. From that, we determined that 175,000 calls required an officer response, which meant that 500 calls a day required physical attendance. This study will talk to you about the new way in which we have learnt that we can provide a first response to non-immediate calls for service, but it will take on a journey from the innovation and the randomised control trial through to implementation and now at replication, moving from a local to regional, potentially national and international replication of the study and the work being implemented within police forces. So to move you forward, what does that look like? So essentially, the randomised control trial was to test whether offering an immediate and optional video conference call with an officer improved service to our victims of domestic abuse. It was targeted at mid-level cases where the offender was absent and there was no imminent risk to the victim. We tracked two methods. We tracked effectiveness and efficiency. Effectiveness was our victim satisfaction survey in this block design randomised control trial, and our efficiency we tracked using geolocation on officers' radios and vehicles. We had enough cases to draw statistical significance on our female intimate block of domestic abuse victims, as they made up 69% of the cohort, and we had a total of 517 cases through the RCT. I'd like to say thank you to Kent McFadden, who's sitting in the audience, because he worked alongside me on this and doesn't often get the recognition that he should when I talk about this. But essentially, you can see there, and I've left it up for a while, the process, and this is actually the tricky part of rapid video response. So you can see a call will come in via its usual route into the control room. After assessment, it gets put through to a virtual dispatcher who will do a risk assessment and put that the call instantly through to a waiting officer. I'm quite sort of determined about this, that it must be an instant connection. But what we are not doing is creating a service and a list to service at some point later in the future, that we are taking victims' calls. We are asking them if they'd like the service, and if they're eligible and safe to do the service, we're then transferring the call immediately through to an officer. We use a video by a company called Good Sound, but essentially it was a software that allowed us to record that consultation and store it and use it in evidence. And we essentially used the software to connect the victims up within 3 minutes. It was an average that it took to get them put through. What were our results from the trial? And it's most important that we start with victim satisfaction, because although we measured efficiency, victim satisfaction and the journey of the victim was what our chief in Kent at the time was most interested in. And what we were able to show was that across the entire group, we had equal satisfaction. But for those victims of female intimate domestic abuse, we were able to increase the satisfaction levels from 78 to 89%, which was a statistically significant finding. We also, during the telephone administered survey, we asked a variety of questions, around 14 questions. As well, we asked about the levels of trust and confidence, and they also increased very nearly, statistically significantly so. We had an 80.5% response rate to our victim survey, so that we know that the results are reliable. And what was really good about this particular finding was, given our investment and interest in trying to improve service for victims of domestic abuse for women and girls, this was really, really relevant for us to be able to draw down and distinguish the data in this way. Victims gave positive comments about the service, saying that they enjoyed the privacy, the convenience, and the speed when they received a rapid video response. This was probably my favourite graph, actually, because it really quite clearly shows the difference in the orange line would be the business as usual response, and the amount of time across the bottom axis that you would have to wait for a physical attendance of an officer. Whereas if you look at the top line, you'll see that within 8 hours, we'd responded to the entire cohort of victims. In addition to the benefits of wait time and victim satisfaction, we were able to improve our officers' time. So it took 1 hour and 23 minutes less time to service a call, as we didn't need to double crew or drive to and from the victim's home address. And what we were able to show was that the average response time for a BAU call, our control group, was 32 hours and 49 minutes, as opposed to the 3 minutes that it took to connect straight through to a video officer. That essentially means, if you've read the article, I didn't do the maths, but that we're 656 times faster in our police response, and that in that time that those victims will be awaiting a physical attendance, a quarter of all victims will call back into the control room whilst they're awaiting attendance. What did that lead to? So in Kent, we implemented on the 18th of May last year. We've now serviced actually over 3,000 RVR calls, but this data was from 2,172 calls that were carried out in the first 9 months of implementation. 99% of those victims that were surveyed described themselves as satisfied. There was an improvement in response times, which I can detail. Essentially, the number of our DA calls that we were able to respond to within 2 hours went from an average of 100 per month to 350 per month. We were able to increase officer morale and save, in doing so, 8,620 hours of officer time. So then we can come to replication. So obviously Kent were doing this work and implementing it, and there was an amount of interest from other forces nationally. The 7 chief constables and the 7 PCCs of the Eastern Region forces, so that is Essex, Kent, Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, Norfolk and Suffolk, formed a collaboration entitled the Eastern Region Innovation Network, or ERIN, which I became the director of. That is intended to be a centre of excellence for testing and implementing innovation at pace across our eastern region, and is very much supported and delivered by Mr. Harrington and Mark Kearton, who I believe is here, who are two of the chief constables that drive forward this ability to be able to replicate evidence-based policing across our region and learn from the best practice that everybody is doing within our area. How do we do that? So replication, we created a blueprint. The blueprint model was proven to be very effective because what we were able to do in that was to append all of the documents and necessary guidance, SOPs, force policies that we would need to use to replicate. It has been replicated in a number of forces across the region, which was done so with Home Office funding that was secured. In Essex, the soft launch was at the end of March, and actually I visited the force control room, I think it was last week, and when I walked onto the floor, I saw a little area within the control room and 7 police officers sitting there actively servicing calls all the while that I was there, and they've serviced over 400 calls in the first few months of soft launch. In fact, I've got a case study that I can tell you about. So a female victim of domestic abuse contacted Essex Police to report a breach of a non-molestation order, stalking, malicious communications and criminal damage by her ex-partner. The DASH risk assessment was completed and the indication was that it was high. This was due to the suspect being previously breaching orders and having firearms warnings. The initial call came into the control room at 9:45. The RVR consultation began at 9:57 and it concluded at 12:18 hours. Whilst the RVR call was being completed, the proactive orders and arrest team arrested the suspect at 15:05 hours the same day. I've got many of case studies, but that was just a prime example of the speed at which we're able to effect arrests and deal with victims' calls. Implementation feedback, you can see some there. They're from Kent officers. I've managed to get one hot off the press from an Essex call recently where the victim said, "I want to pass on a massive thank you to the PC as I felt at ease, relaxed. They spent so much time with me, not rushing me. Everything was nice and clear and clearly documented whilst on the video. They even spoke to me when another incident had occurred." The victim response and satisfaction was clear from the surveys. I spoke to some of the victims during some of the trials that I've undertaken, and I know Mr. Harrington very strongly believes in the service that we're providing to our vulnerable victims of domestic abuse and that we need to get that right. The complexity of domestic abuse investigations has changed and the demand is ever increasing. So we need to find other ways to service victims, other tested ways in which we can do that. This ability that we've had to be able to replicate the innovation and see it working and supporting victims is actually the most rewarding thing that has happened really when I get to read some of these case studies. So probably I just want to share with you, the work that you're doing, if you can get it to have an impact on policing, so what, as we've already heard this morning, then I really wish you the very best of luck and hopefully you found it interesting.